I've been asked if I was adopted since I was 7 years old. Shyly, one of my peers would whisper to me on the bus ride home or beneath the din of homeroom noise to ask who or where my real mother was. It would be years before I fully understood that question. It was obvious to me that the woman who waited for me every early afternoon on the porch of our old house, its ancient walls cracking with green and white paint, was my mother. But often enough that I remember even now, I was left confused again and again, on school bus seats and classroom desks and during parent-teacher conferences, frustrated and amused in equal measure by what my child ego could only excuse as clear incompetence. In spite of our identical slim eyes, full cheeks, thick dark hair, and wide smiles, my mother still wasn't always believed to be my mother, if she was even thought to be a mother at all. I remember the middle school dance where we were stopped, barred from leaving because the chaperones didn't believe her when she told them she was an adult. It's a funny anecdote now due to her quick wit and disarming charm, but I often linger on those memories now, and wonder what the sum total of all of them mean. And I know now, really. The reason is obvious. She's brown, and I'm white. My father's Irish heritage had bleached any notion of my indigeneity like a slate board swiped with an eraser, my red hair bleaching into blonde, then brown with age. To have been robbed of it, the evidence of the heritage and community that throbs through half my blood, is a theft that I'll never be able to fully put to words adequately, especially as toted lineages of Indian genes remain fashionable among white families, leashing themselves to a land that they live upon as deeply and as falsely as they do nations they've never known. This hypervigilance has been at the heart of my relationship to my ethnic identity, an ever-present awareness that not only am I an outsider to my people that my mixed lineage has made me to be, but that at any moment I can be called into question as not only a liar, but as a thief as well, a colonizing carnivore of culture that's merely the last in a centuries-long plunder of the heritage of indigenous peoples. For this reason, the only place I'd ever been able to safely treasure the cultural inheritance I'd been denied is in media. A paperback of Dances with Wolves, my most shameful substitute for a connection to any material relationship to my ancestry. Consuming whatever content I could find that bared even the faintest proximity to indigeneity, it was only natural that I would eventually turn to my only other obsession as deep and as long-running as that of my heritage. None other than Magic the Gathering. It was only after I started digesting everything I'd uncovered later in life as an adult, however, that I began to fully understand the breadth of Wizards of the Coast's complicated history on representing cultures like mine with any care for accuracy or respect. My name's Joe, and I'm a Magic the Gathering content creator. My pronouns are he, him, and my family is from the deep south of the United States of America, though I've never lived there myself. As a Magic YouTuber with my particular background, I feel especially well-suited to discuss the history of WotC depicting the Indigenous Americans of the United States and Canada, and their cultural iconography, context, and stereotypes. What I don't feel well-suited to cover, for example, are the native peoples of the Arctic Circle or the empires of Central and South America and their colonized neighbors, although Wizards has had a troubled history with depicting them properly too, largely the latter in their setting of Ixalan, one of the Magic multiverse's many planes. It's not a rarity or an oddity for Magic the Gathering, as the majority of the settings, locations, and characters are some form of cultural appreciation at the best of times, and cultural appropriation, a scary word, I know, but be brave, we'll survive them all together if we just believe in each other and hold on tight, in the worst of them. If you want a black perspective on this pervasive issue, for example, I'd recommend Amanda Stevens' writing over on Commander's Herald. Link is in the citations sections of the down there part. But now that we understand the perspective we're employing to engage with Magic the Gathering's worlds, one in particular, which I'm sure many of you were clever enough to figure out, or alternatively read the chapter titles for the video prematurely, and Wizards of the Coast's stewardship of them as a company, let's begin. Magic the Gathering's attempts to engage with the legends and folklore of Indigenous Americans begins in 1995. The Ice Age expansion featuring the Wiitigo, a 6-mana 0/0 creature-type Yeti that adds or subtracts one of its 6+1/+1 counters based on whether or not it's fed on your opponent's creatures, represented by blocking or being blocked by them in game terms. It's pretty worthless as a game piece in 2025 Magic. An obvious pastiche of the Algonquin nation's most famous malevolent spirit, popularized by horror media such as television series Supernatural and Hannibal, and video games like Until Dawn and Fallout 76, the latter being an IP now introduced to the multiverse through the universe's Beyond initiative, and all critiqued for their lack of Indigenous writers. Its name not wholly apparating out of a jumbling of consonant and vowel sounds that bear a vague familiarity to the most popular term for the creature, the double I at the beginning of its name references the original Ojibwe word for the entity, one which would eventually win out as the precursor to the English translation. Out of respect for the cultures referenced, the cannibalistic cryptid will go unnamed throughout this section of the video essay, even as I'm almost certain you've heard it said aloud before, despite Indigenous communities' persistent requests to do otherwise. Still, given that this was the era where Wizards printed racial slurs in card names and commissioned actual neo-Nazi Harold McNeil to depict the Ku Klux Klan on card number 1488 on the official Magic database Gatherer, perhaps this wasn't their most callous disregard for respecting non-white cultures. However, given that 2006's Shape of the Wiitigo from Cold Snap references the original in name and aesthetics as faithfully as it does its mechanics, it can't be said that they learned much in the decade that followed. Legendary Magic artist Ron Spencer depicts an archetypical tribal shaman, a stereotype that itself will warrant analysis later in this video, in his piece for the card. The primitive man clad in hide and weave, an icon of a moon capping the end of his rough-hewn stave. In this portrait, we learn two important details. First, that the Wiitigo, much like its folkloric origin, is a creature able to possess the form of a man through the transformation of his body, the blood-slicked maws inset into his palms presumably hearkening to a shifting through the hunger that's found in the traditional Native American legend. And second, that this particular victim of the Wiitigo's cannibalistic urges is white. This juxtaposition of a non-Indigenous victim falling prey to a creature of Indigenous legend is no outlier among mainstream media. Indeed, genres such as horror and horror fantasy remain traditionally inaccessible to Indigenous peoples, rare exceptions such as 2022's Prey and Slash Back, and 2025's Sinners proving the rule. Few major motion pictures releasing in the years before or since that permit our culture's stories told with our own agency and perspective. What inclusion does exist in these movies is traditionally secondary and oftentimes hostile or victimized, writers and directors relegating our folkloric monsters to play the singular role of antagonist to a cast of white protagonists and the white audience they act as proxy for. Our bodies likewise used as merely fodder for the in-universe and often incorrect mythology for the creature depicted. As said by researcher Francesca Johnson,
they only serve to either act as an aid or destroy in relation to the white character's goals or obstacles, dependent on the story's whim. Thusly, in these horror narratives, becomes the supernatural foe that is only allowed to be what the narrative wants it to be in relation to its main focus of white people and non-Indigenous white culture.
Spencer is undoubtedly blameless for this centering of whiteness in a piece featuring an Indigenous-coded monster, for Tertiaire, the setting of Cold Snap, is home to the distinctly Nordic-inspired cultures of the Balduvians and Kjeldorans who play protagonists for this excursion to Dominaria. The victim of the Wiitigo was most likely the former. His shamanic garb is almost certainly inspired by the stereotypes of primitive, heathen northern barbarians. Medieval Christendom's accounts of its remaining pagan neighbors as unflattering and mischaracterizing as the future imperialist narratives its inheritors wove to justify conquering the lands of the New World. Still, while this explains the piece's anachronism and erasure, it doesn't justify it. The inclusion of the Wiitigo in this manner alone a refusal to correct the mistakes of the Wizards of the Coast that existed over a decade prior. It would be almost another 2 decades after this decision until WotC dared to reattempt to code their characters in bestiary to Indigenous ones, the era of Invoke Prejudice, Jihad, and Pradesh exchanged for the next, where such cards were banned for racist depiction, text, or combination thereof. Finally, it seemed Wizards' policy for cultural sensitivity was changing, and perhaps alongside it, the opportunity for a respectful depiction of the people I'd felt alienated from since birth, but inexorably linked to as well. In November of 2023, Magic the Gathering first recognized a demographic of its player base it never had before. With the re-release of Khans of Tarkir and Magic Arena, the long-standing card type Tribal was replaced by Kindred. Alongside it, the Totem armor mechanic received errata to Umbra armor. This was, of course, not without its controversy. The language of Magic is an obtuse and esoteric one, a chimera of decades-old game jargon alongside equally indecipherable and ever-increasing errata and controversial lore retcons that, when compounded, form an impenetrable barrier to new players. Just as Anna or Bug eventually became Sultai and Berry was replaced by Sacrifice, there's nothing new or novel about an update to the game's code. Yet, in parallel with the aforementioned bannings of racially insensitive cards across all formats, Magic for the first time was making rules updates not for balance purposes, but out of respect for the cultures adopted and absorbed into the tapestry of its creative and world-building decisions. Among these, coincidentally, the Ojibwe resurfaces as a cultural focus, as while the oft-derogatory tribal has had broader use as a pejorative term for both indigenous North Americans and global populations of colonized peoples. Totem, in contrast to tribal, is a specific anglicization of the Ojibwe word dudem, or a totemon. A conspicuously ill-fitting magic mechanic for 2010's Rise of the Eldrazi, Totem Armor's place in its game design canon sits alongside such heavy hitters as Sweep, or for a more recent example, Cloak, only present on a handful of cards across 3 of the game's 5 colors. An auras-based keyword in a block that centers lands matter mechanics in a set focused on huge colorless creatures and reaching the mana threshold required to cast them, this offering to the Enchantress archetype would feel more at home on Pastoral Theros or Haunted Duskmourn. That coincidentally, the first reappearance of this keyword was in the Planechase 2012 deck Savage Auras fails to help justify its name or place on Zendikar, instead undermining the former with the use of the hopefully unintentional racist connotation with, and mind you, this is the most charitable reading, the Noble Savage archetype, and confusing the latter by depicting the cards bearing its rules text being predominantly employed by the heroes of Ravnica and Dominaria, rather than the relative few Core or Gnarlid that can be found in the deck list. But, indeed, the magic is littered with poorly thought-out actions of either willful ignorance or freak misfortune, with Umbra Mystic, the only card granting the ability to auras, depicting a woman surrounded by animals found on the North American continent, owl, wolf, hare, and mink being joined by the medieval fantasy griffin. Of course, this songbird-slinging sorceress is white. Victim of the Wiitigo, we meet again. But little do we know at the time, this spring cleaning of Magic the Gathering's repeated mistake of engaging with cultural insensitivity and racial injustice by proxy of these poorly named mechanics was merely the precursor to far larger debates, ones that still echo in the minds of Indigenous and non-Indigenous players alike, given the sheer scale of the blundered mishandling of America's history and its relationship to its first peoples when Magic went Western. In April of 2024, Magic the Gathering first visited the plane of Thunder Junction, a world where no people are indigenous, a land where neither tribe nor nation inhabits its frontier facade. Rather than the reality of the American West, it represented the myth of its settling, a falsehood still paraded on plywood by Old West tourist traps, a narrative popularized in Buffalo Bill's sensationalist and anti-indigenous Wild West traveling circuses. It's the reason this video essay exists. Remember my lampshading that one plane above all others bears the brunt of this essay's focus? That plane is Thunder Junction. Fans quickly noted the ghoulish resemblance Outlaws of Thunder Junction's world building had to Manifest Destiny, the belief that it was inevitable and moral for the then infant nation of the United States to conquer and dominate its frontiers, displacing those peoples that it did not genocide. But even as Magic refuses to confront the uncomfortable subject of the mass death of First Nation peoples, it did not pause to market its settings with our bodies and our culture. The Aten, we are told, are travelers of the infinite planes of the multiverse, sojourners who remain for little time on each world they trek. They are human, with tanned flesh and dark hair, their attire either naturalistic or woven in geometric patterns. They are, all pretense put aside, Navajo. At MagicCon Chicago, we were told as much by the cultural consultants the game has employed since, at minimum, before February 2022, the release window of the revisit to the fan-favorite Japanese-inspired plane of Kamigawa. In spite of the simulacrum of indigeneity that the Aten occupy in the setting of Thunder Junction, nowhere was the cultural sensitivity of Wizards of the Coast's advisors more presently felt than the work of individual creatives of the set. Artists who I struggle to doubt include members of the same cultural legacy that I do, or in the case of one particular author, I know for a fact does. H.E. Edgman's Thunder Junction side story Blood is Thicker Than Venom moved me to hot, aching tears by the end of its short 6,000 words, a narrative I fully believe incapable for anyone else to tell, myself included, given the proximity to the culture drawn from. Perhaps it's because of the divorce I feel from my own culture that I reacted so strongly. In spite of our difference in nation, a shared inheritance of colonialism melts away all our ethnic distinctions, rendering them insignificant before a parable of loss and alienation that's tragically common. Nowhere did I feel that old wound of otherness burn greater than reading the exchange between our protagonist Annie Flash, or as she is known by her Aten name, Haseya, and her nephew upon the discovery of his plan to depart back to their people's nomad caravans. She narrows her eyes at him, clasping her hands in front of herself.
No. Where are you going?
Home, Auntie.
This is your...
Home.
He emphasizes, eyes burning with a fire Tommy ain't had since he started on the blue smoke.
Back to our people.
Fellow YouTuber and Magic video essayist Spice8Rack's pseudo-duology on the subject of colonialism, A Very Normal Look at Tarkir and Magic the Gathering and the Death of the Future, interrogate this fiction and stories similar to it in more than we have time for in this semi-autobiographical account. But as companion pieces to this video, they're worth a watch. As it notes, why does Haseya assume the identity of Annie at all? In an American frontier without Native Americans, how can anti-Indigenous bigotry and policy still force the Aten to choose to change their names to be palatable for language and culture of their colonizers? These are not questions to pose to Edgemont, who admirably wrote a gripping and painfully sincere glimpse into his own people's alienation from the hegemon of mainstream white America and the need for the conservation of their systematically eradicated ways, but for Wizards of the Coast, who failed their individual artists and creatives by erecting a falsehood of the American West's brutal domination, forcing them to try their best to retrofit poor world-building decisions made for the sake of marketing a product to white audiences into earnest and tactful Native representation. The card illustrators for the set depict a range of high fantasy Indigenous Americans that chart the full gamut of genre trope space, from spell-slinging arcane rogues freewheeling aces at gambling parlors and sultry saloons, to frontier sheriff rangers that invoke the legacy of the drow iconoclast Dritz Doerden, or the shadowy strider and the prancing pony. It would be all too easy to costume the Aten purely in bones and buffalo skins, refusing to allow them to interface with the rest of the multiverse's bizarre and fantastical aesthetic variability, or far worse, erase any cultural signifier that there are people unto themselves at all. WotC's artist culture now far removed from Ron Spencer's revisit to the Wiitigo, that they didn't do either is something I'm deeply appreciative of, despite the half-continent's difference between where my people and the people the Aten inspired walked. As I cherish this success, this glimpse into an alternate Aten, a stolen glance into a world that's coherent and diligent in its burden and duty of respect and care towards representing the Navajo artistically, just as the Kildorans and Zendikari failed to even attempt to do to the Ojibwe, I'm left mourning the dissonance between what are clearly, while not my people, a people like mine, the voices of those educated on or intimate with the culture XP singing and screaming through the whitewashed, literally whitewashed, corporate effigy of what a First Nation is in a world where no one can be Indigenous, no one can be born to soil colonized by imperial interest in white man's hands. If only Thunder Junction had a First Nation of its own, then maybe Wizards wouldn't seem as gutless as it does for erasing the Indians from cowboys and Indians like it erased the cops of mafia-inspired New Capenna. If only. Doubtlessly, there are those of you in the audience who have caught me in my lie. Indeed, I have deceived you. Their lack of mention was no mere error. For there actually is a race indigenous to Thunder Junction. It's just not the Aten. Of course, I'm talking about the Cactusfolk. Confirmed by lore master for Magic the Gathering Jay and Ellie to have been animated by the plane's post-Omen Path Awakening, the Cactusfolk are the only inhabitants of Thunder Junction to have not arrived from elsewhere in the multiverse. A fantasy race characterized by their bristly, rugged attitudes, the Cactusfolk are obviously inhuman, their hexapedal bodies and eyeless faces invoking an alien physiology unlike anything that exists upon our world. Sharing more similarities with the creatures of Edge of Eternities, their adaptation to the arid dunes of their home plane expresses itself in their unnatural tenacity and resilience, a fortitude to face the oncoming despoilment of these extraplanar visitors. In short, they're the perfect uncolonizable people, able to resist conquest through their supernatural kinship with the land and hyper-specialized physique, quite literally propagated by the Sands in an identical manner to the Sagaro they're inspired by. Only rather than warring with the invaders to their home and the preconceived attitudes of exploitation they arrive with, like the victims of Bolas's War of the Spark or the Phyrexian invasion, they indulge in the same system of theft, be it in land or in bodies. A conspicuous number of cards depicting Cactusfolk printed with one of the eponymous creature types, it's ludonarratively suggested that many Cactusfolk have abandoned their stewardship of the land to play the same tired, tropey game of sheriffs and outlaws. The Cactusfolk aren't allowed to have a distinct cultural identity of their own, instead rendered only as a marketable mascot race for the setting, an alien people that we only interface with through the perspective of their colonizers, the camera lens focused only on the assimilationists among them. So where exactly does that leave us? Two communities inhabiting the same world, each with their own contentious claim to the title of the indigenous people's XP of the set, yet neither truly embodying the entirety of what that demonym means. The Aten aren't indigenous, not to Thunder Junction at least, and the Cactusfolk aren't a people, it being told to us on the card Badlands Revival that their culture is young, only intimate with the conceptual cycle of life and death. This dichotomy between these two races is evident. In one, we find a representation of the physical characteristics and cultural signifiers of the nation they're based off of, where in the other, we find those same people's historical context and the relationship to imperial despoilment, if not genocide. But this is not the only harsh, jagged line we've seen drawn in the sands of Thunder Junction's Badlands between these two groups' depiction. One of the many similarities drawn between the Atten and the Cactusfolk is in their colors of mana. Both firmly centered in green, the Atten gradually spread to its neighboring colors first through white and then to the allies beyond. The Cactusfolk, meanwhile, are almost entirely constrained to green and green-red, but encroach along the color pie counterclockwise, eventually ending in black, the only color that does not express itself in the more chromatically diverse Atten. Correctly careful not characterize the Atten with the color of mana most associated with ruthlessness and greed. Through their inhumanity, the Cactusfolk and their culture are permitted to embody such traits, the fear of embodying negative stereotype not a concern when the people depicted are not parallels to a real people who have historically suffered the indignities of stereotype and oppression. Even in their hesitancy, WotC's cultural consultancy is neither a monolith of opinion nor capable of eliminating all bias from their creative design teams. Personally, I find the heavy emphasis and overrepresentation of the color green in particular edges far too close to the previously invoked stereotype of the noble savage, due to its narrative ties of strong connection and oneness with the land, as well as unquestioned tradition and cultural conservatism, philosophies that have underpinned the color since the game's inception. Players will disagree with this interpretation. I know Native American Magic players who disagree with this interpretation, but nevertheless, it exists as a valid critique of the set's world-building given Wizards of the Coast's cowardice in both choosing to invoke pop culture iconography distilled from racist media depictions of decades prior, while refusing to interface with the historical conditions and biases that informed them. Sure, Cactusfolk being dominantly green is a natural consequence of being a sentient race of plants, but if the human-appearing characters that they exist in parallel to as Indigenous representation follow the exact same demographics, can these associations truly be said to be typal, or perhaps more accurately, tribal, gameplay? Allo Alchemist and Patient Naturalist are descendants of the same card design lineage. Little more has evolved beyond the attitudes that spawned the Wiitigo than what WotC would like you to believe. The attempt to depict an authentic Wild West of Fool's Gambit, cowardice and corporate sanitization, nested concepts if not one and the same, shackled creatives that understood and or lived the very life stories that gave rise to the tropes of a white supremacist culture's view of indigeneity. 2 steps forward and 1 step back, the question naturally arises that if Wizards of the Coast fails in its repeated attempts to hawk stories that are only indigenous in a purely allegorical sense, how would they fare if they were given the explicit task to translate a real Native American character into cardboard? Well, the answer is less nebulous than you might think. In July of that same year, once again we braved the mire of the much-maligned Universes Beyond initiative, perhaps at its second highest point of player derision and disparagement, eclipsed only by the original mechanically unique The Walking Dead Secret Lair announcement. A revisit to the innovative technology of March of the Machine, The Aftermath. Beyond boosters let us crack packs to discover the world of an outside IP in more bite-sized pieces. Only 10 cards wrapped in cellophane and foil. A setting? A fictionalized but historical Earth. The brand behind it? Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed series. I have never played Assassin's Creed. While my love for video games has forever altered my taste in media and burned a hole in the pocket money I accrued as a young boy, I struggled to connect with games of its genre. Too enraptured by the endless sandbox of Minecraft or Azeroth's meticulously handcrafted locales in the World of Warcraft, which, in its own manner, struggled to depict Native American cultures with dignity and respect, yet too has since made stride in its commitments to cultural sensitivity, Assassin's Creed couldn't find enough purchase in my attention to become an entry in my personal gaming canon. But in spite of that, what I do remember of Assassin's Creed was Connor Kenway. Divorced from the culture of the people that my mother and her father before me hail from, witnessing an Indigenous American protagonist cast as a hero in a Usonian-focused narrative, one that took place in the very same region that I was born, even if it's not where my ancestors were, provided a surrogate sense of self-worth through which I could identify that thread in the tapestry of my personhood as something to be admired, something valiant and brave. I have never played Assassin's Creed, but I know the Assassin's Creed 3 trailer that played as an advertisement on early 2010s YouTube in between gaming videos from the Yogscast, Total Biscuit, and OMFG Kata by heart. In the decade that followed, I largely forgot about Connor, my interests in theater eclipsing my fascination with video games I never had the skill to play on consoles I could never afford. Gone was Fallout New Vegas, Team Fortress 2, and the Half-Life series from my search history, replaced by the soundtracks to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, Bonnie and Clyde, and Little Shop of Horrors. Stowed away in the attic, packed in a little box of memories, it waited to be reawakened until the Hasbro copyright lawyers behind Magic the Gathering's IP crossovers made one of the worst marketing decisions of their ill-fated careers. they approved a lot of intellectual property being put in very small booster packs. But in those silvery aborted plans for the future of Magic distribution, ones that, and I should make mention of this in a brief aside, were literally given away for free with my margarita in a gaming bar I once visited and played Magic in, I found some warm, tender, slightly fuzzy memory. Viewed from a different perspective, I didn't recapture my feelings on Connor Kenway. No, I discovered how I felt about Ratonhnhaké for the first time. There exists a power in names. It's partially why the enduring mythic wisdom that you can bind a demon by uttering what name it is called in the hells, or how one must always fail to provide their own when dealing with the capricious fae, continues to persist in folktales and fantasy fiction. It's for this reason that I found it powerful that the designers intentionally made the less accessible to Western pronunciation, yet far more culturally profound decision to invoke the Haudenosaunee name as the canonical one for his sole representation in the set's card gallery. Considering how low Thunder Junction's admittedly feeble attempt at providing a more diverse cast of Magic characters was by the forums and subreddits where I found discussions on the set centered, surely this would be exalted as a return to form. The cultural consultancy of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty and the then-future Tarkir Dragonstorm homoosian to Assassin's Creed, of the same substance. But the same community that indignantly demanded a fuller, more sincere depiction of my race when Wizards of the Coast dared to attempt it, myself included in that putsch, in part went on to bemoan the unpronounceable names of the set, such as Basim ibn Ishaq and Adewale, Ratonhnhaké being an especially notable point of contention. Allyship extended only so far as it was convenient for gameplay, it seemed. Many more words can be spared to discuss the mistakes in Magic the Gathering X Assassin's Creed. The set was a mistake after all, but while it's incredibly fun, easy too, to comment on Wizards of the Coast's second pass at an already known failure at the time of its first attempt, I find this microcosm of this release's response a far more salient one for the subject of this essay. It begs the question, would players have responded more resoundingly to Haseya than Annie if segments of the player base couldn't have done the same for Ratonhnhaké? Was there secretly a validity to the gutless whitewashing of the American West in order to curb negative, dare I say racist, sentiment? My answer is a resounding fuck no. The purpose of art is to challenge the viewer, and if I've been able to instill any core belief about the medium that Magic exists in itself through this essay's examination of its history, its language, and its culture, I pray that it is an art form, albeit one shackled by the irons of capital and castrated by the razor of white fragility. In this internment, Native people's stories have been penned in ways that manage to break censure and confinement, and any possible suggestion to a less revolutionary alternative chosen because it's more palatable to a larger audience isn't just sickening, it's cowardly. It's the rhetoric of the anti-woke mob, people so complacent in their apolitical normalcy erected atop a land made sick with the carrion of shot and skinned bison herds, and kept that way with serpentine oil fields running through the land that was stolen twice. It's tragic that I felt the need to even briefly entertain it. So what is the alternative? If what Magic is presently doing reads as non-functional and toothless, and its attempts to do anything more in the barest, most meager ways are met with inter-community backlash from a, potentially very small, subject of the player base, what does Wizards of the Coast do to both appease their newfound push for cultural conscientiousness while not risking the contempt of the diverse averse of their audience? The answer is relatively straightforward. Whatever it is you do not talk about it openly and often. Ever since the months following the June 2024 set release Modern Horizons 3, a conspicuous absence from the MTG creature type catalog has been noticed by a specific demographic of Magic players. You see, while Tribal and Totem armor had been publicly acknowledged as falling out of favor of Wizards' world design and cultural consultancy ethos, another ill-informed piece of fantasy genre convention jargon was only thought to be pernicious in a subtler context, where it was admissible but only when given proper heed to its real-world applications. An eventual announcement clarifying this, it would take the most observant of Magic creature type aficionados and typal deck builders asking the head designer of Magic the Gathering himself, Mark Rosewater, on his Tumblr page Blogatog for the public to learn what was going on. Rage Forger fans demanding to know what happened to the Morningtide icon's favorite creature type, Rosewater had this to say.
We're being a bit more exact in how we use Shaman to reflect what Shamans are. New Shaman cards can still happen. The issue is what we're labeling a Shaman has gotten narrower.
Now, unlike the aforementioned Tribal and Totem armor, Shaman as a creature type is unique for the primary subject of this video essay. It's not a term associated in near exclusivity to the indigenous peoples of North America. In fact, the term Shaman doesn't even originate from any Native American languages, rather coming from the term Saman of the indigenous communities of Northwest Asia and the Ural-Alatic. So why am I even talking about it? I considered Ixalan beyond the scope of this video essay, even as the Sun Empire is based heavily on North American indigenous groups, just ones from a different historical context and discipline of study. No Native American indigenous communities have ever referred to their spiritual leaders by the shaman moniker historically. But that doesn't mean other groups haven't, nor that they haven't done so ahistorically. Taking a step back, if this video essay is an examination of my own conflict surrounding having a direct biological lineage informed by Nine Nations history with colonialism against its indigenous peoples, while also having no such cultural signifiers that this very same act's presence is in my bloodline, is it so unimaginable that there might be others that feel like me? If imperialism and capitalism are so ruthlessly efficient machines as to alienate their victims from their ancestry and culture, would there be no white American demographic that could relate to the subject of this video? Could I have just as easily wrote this essay about my Irish heritage if I had felt that stolen from me in a way that I presently don't? The truth is, yes. Many Americans, even non-mixed race Americans, have to thrash against that void in their hearts, hollowed out by possessing no cultural legacy to examine themselves through. But the average American doesn't write 40-minute-long videos delving into that subject through the lens of Magic the Gathering. No, many of the waspy suburbanite baby boomers choose instead to reach out and plunder what they still can from the cultures their ancestors nearly eradicated from this earth. At least that's kind of a legacy to embody. Enter the plastic shaman, a term I first saw attributed to Richard L. Allen, research and policy analyst for the Cherokee Nation, a demographic of predominantly white New Age folk healers that co-opt the aesthetic of indigeneity and attribute their practice to Native American teachers that may or may not exist, if they don't claim to be spiritually, if not ethnically, Native American themselves. Post-colonial theorist and Native American studies researcher Lisa Aldred describes this archetype at length in her examinations of the New Age movement, writing,
Certainly, plastic shamans, as well as other New Age entrepreneurs, could be viewed as ransackers of Native American spiritual traditions in search of ways to market them to consumers. They produce new interpretations by fusing bastardized versions of these traditions with self-help pop psychology, as well as exotic blends appropriated from other cultural traditions.
Seeking to stitch together a spirituality and cultural background through regurgitating ill-fitting pieces of other cultures that they don't fully understand, like paleontology through the medium of owl pellet dissection. Plastic Shaman catered to the same instinct I had and tried to personally respond to through making this video essay, albeit serving a very different audience. The average consumer of their huckster wisdom isn't indigenous, nor do they largely even feel the need to pretend to be. The point isn't authenticity to the self, it's accuracy to a non-existent, untainted, spiritually pure way of life, no matter the strength of their personal claim to its practice. They prey upon an audience that doesn't know better, cudgeling a culture to fit their preconceptions of it and the need they have to thoughtlessly use the same marketable term to signal legitimacy as a spiritual leader. In short, they reach for the same title you'd find in a D&D sourcebook, or on a magic card. The average Magic the Gathering player has no idea that Mark Rosewater posts on Blogatog. They have no idea who Mark Rosewater even is. But the choice he made to announce the shift away from such a loaded and misappropriated terms and rules text was an important one. In doing so, they removed ammunition from the snake oil salesmen who traffic in fake mysticism, stigmatizing the label in small part by refusing to continue its use in the context where it's likely many people would engage with it for the first time. In a game for children, the majority of properties that employ the word shaman do so callously. Looking at you once again, World of Warcraft. So the thoughtful choice to step away from the term is one that I commend WotC for making, if only to get back at those continuing the theft of my heritage under a label that isn't even mine. It's much the same issue as the one with the Rakshasa, but that isn't as much mine to comment on as this is. Just to date the script, while I was editing it for the first time, Magic the Gathering Final Fantasy previewed upcoming releases that include cards with the Shaman creature type despite Morrow's stated initiative due to its presence in the series. While this is another obvious reason that the universe's Beyond experiment has been a creative and brand cohesion nightmare, outside intellectual property holders now being able to directly make decisions for Wizards of the Coast on cultural sensitivity and respect, I'll not continue to linger on it beyond this restatement of my point. Suffice to say, Chocobos now trot on the commercialized graves of my ancestors, and everything that I just praised Mark Rosewater and Wizards of the Coast for is only true when they're not adapting an IP that makes them $200 million in one day. How fun. And that is the last of Magic the Gathering's legacy with indigeneity and colonialism. Not so much ending with a bang as with a whimper. Perhaps this video would have been more appropriately timed with the announcement of Thunder Junction, but I didn't have a YouTube platform during its pre-release weekend. Sure, Magic would revisit the concepts explored there in the recent Edge of Eternity through the lens of the Kav and the Umidians' conflicts over Avendo, but the science fiction lens and inhumanity of the belligerents involved makes this, in my opinion, largely uninteresting to analyze. It begs the question, what if James Cameron's Avatar featured warring alien species, making the obvious allegory intended even more strained? As quality of a story as that may be, what interests me about indigeneity and magic are the peoples that it represents and how they resemble those same peoples in real life and what that might tell us. So what have I learned? What does magic say about me? I'll tell you. There will never be a character in Magic the Gathering exactly like me. In the endless quest for total representation, there are already 1,000 cultures and peoples who are devoid of any consideration, who are already unconsidered by Wizards of the Coast for decades, and unfortunately will likely continue to remain forgotten for decades more. Thunder Junction was, in spite of its many, many failures, a singular triumph, as for the first time in the multiverse we were able to glimpse into the deeply resonant story of Yuma and Kiri, the first trans-masculine character in the multiverse and his adopted Cactusfolk child. But in this victory, find an all too common weakness of Magic's story, as it took from 2014 to Outlaws of Thunder Junction's 2024 release an entire decade before the inclusion of a trans-feminine character in the Con of Tarkir Alessia was met with her equivalent in this Capennan barkeep. Fortunately, this issue appears to be finally facing ongoing attempts to improve diversity and representation in Magic, as Felithar the Abzan now numbers as the third binary transgender Magic the Gathering character. But even in this relative obscurity, at least transgender characters are known to inhabit Magic's multiverse. Is Karn as a golem as much a piece of Jewish representation as he was the game's first pseudo-transmasculine one, as much as Xantcha was his trans-feminine counterpart? Are we comfortable with Jamura as the only culturally African plane in all of Magic, even while there are countless European ones? Do you know the name of a deaf planeswalker? This video took a long time to produce. Between personal commitments, a battle with COVID-19, and a number of setbacks caused by Magic choosing to revisit the subject of this essay repeatedly, as I was closer and closer to finishing it up, perpetually extending the project, increasing its scope, a lot was either left on the cutting room floor or mounted as a pile of tangentially related subjects. As a partially autobiographical piece, there were always going to be barely relevant interjections that had little to do with Magic itself and more to do with my experience interfacing with my own culture. Still, what this has left me with is a few additional concluding thoughts. If you'd like to hear them, stick around. But if you don't, it's been a pleasure to share this with you, and subscribe to listen to more content like this. Sincerely, whatever the case, you have my thanks. In conjunction with this video essay, I developed a different kind of tribal deck list, and I've decided to post it in the description of this video. It's one that I'm really proud of. I look forward to playing it for as long as Magic exists, despite its growth and its decay, its missteps and its strides towards inclusivity and representation. Even as I have built and cherished a dozen of its kind, this one means a lot to me, in a way that cardboard rarely does. During the production of this video, Indigenous actor Jonathan Joss tragically passed away, or at least that's what the official report would have you believe. If you believe his grieving widower, and I do, Jonathan Joss was murdered. I hope I've done a small service to his legacy by broadcasting not only our media's failure to represent our shared heritage, but also to the queer community that we're both a part of. If you'd like to continue to consume video content starring Indigenous actors, King of the Hill or Parks and Recreation would currently be at the top of my list. I also recently finished binging Twin Peaks: The Return, and Michael Horse's performance as Deputy Chief Hawk never fails to bring a smile to my face or a tear to my eye whenever it's warranted. As the beating heart of the returning cast sat in the narrative, it brought me a lot of joy to see what was the Native American side character in the original series elevated to such a pivotal role. Because of this, I think it'll be due for a rewatch for me much sooner than I'd normally revisit a series like this. So, if you'll excuse me, I'll be returning to the lodge. I was told in a phone call that there's something about my heritage that'll help me find what's missing.